The smell of coffee in the kitchen, the hum of the fridge, a thin mist curling over the ocean, and then end up being a day you'll never forget? Well, for me, that day began in the upstairs room of the old Whitmore Inn, the same bed and breakfast my grandparents built in 1929. The curtains were lace, the kind you can't buy anymore, and the windows looked straight out toward the Maine coast. I could hear gulls over the Atlantic and smell salt in the air. I had been the keeper of that place most of my life. My late husband, Frank, and I ran it together for 35 years. We'd make blueberry pancakes for the guests, iron crisp sheets, keep the place smelling of cinnamon rolls and clean sea wind. Folks said staying there felt like being in a home you didn't know you missed. But lately, it didn't feel like mine. My son, Evan, and his wife, Melissa, had moved in to help after Frank passed. That was the start of the family manipulation. First little changes. They replaced the old oak banister with glass panels. Said it was modern. Then they swapped out the kitchen's cast iron stove for something sleek and stainless. The soul of the place started slipping away. I told myself, Clara, just pick your battles. After all, they were family. Family doesn't push you aside in your own home, right? But I guess family betrayal creeps in quietly. That morning, Evan called me into town. Closing day, Mom. We're signing the deal. Deal? I asked. My hands were still damp from rinsing pie plates. Selling the inn, he said, like it was a fact, not a discussion. When I stepped into that glossy boardroom, the smell of expensive coffee hit me first. A realtor in a tailored suit smiled at me, or maybe through me. Melissa patted the chair in the corner. Sit there, Clara. Just a formality. Her voice was sugar with a sharp edge. The table was lined with people, lawyers, mortgage brokers, the buyer's team. And there, right in the middle, was a folder stamped $18.5 million in neat, dark ink. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a conversation. It was a property theft in broad daylight. Melissa leaned toward me, her perfume strong enough to choke a gull. You're not on the deed, Clara. You've got no say. Sign the papers and let the grown-ups work. Her words were sweet poison. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room glance my way, then quickly away. Elder abuse doesn't always happen in nursing homes. Sometimes it happens under crystal chandeliers, with contracts instead of bruises. I sat there, folded my hands in my lap, the lace of my cuff brushing my skin. My heart wasn't racing, it was steady, because here's what no one in that room knew. For the past year, I have been quietly untangling the mess they'd made of my life. And if you'll stay with me, I'll tell you how a so-called harmless old woman turned a real estate fraud into the sweetest justice you've ever heard. You know, betrayals rarely arrive like thunder. They seep in like water through a crack in the roof, quiet, persistent, and damaging if you don't patch it in time. When Evan and Melissa first moved into the Whitmore Inn, I convinced myself it was temporary. Evan had lost a big investment deal down in Portland, something about a failed condo development, and they just needed a place to regroup. At first, I was glad for the company. The nights in Maine can get awfully still, and it felt nice to have another pot of coffee brewing in the morning. But it didn't take long before I noticed small acts of family manipulation, little comments that cut deeper than they seemed meant to. One afternoon, Melissa hosted a wine and cheese evening for her friends from the city. I baked my famous molasses cookies, thinking they might like a taste of the inn's old charm. When the guests arrived, Melissa waved toward me with a bright, fake smile. This is Clara, she said. She's been with the property forever. Knows every corner. Like our longtime housekeeper. The laugh that followed wasn't mean exactly, but it was sharp enough to slice my dignity in half. And she didn't correct it. I stood there holding my tray of cookies, the sugar still warm under my fingertips, while the cold in my chest spread just a little further. Then came the changes to the inn itself. My great-grandfather's hand-carved dining table, gone, replaced by something with glass and chrome legs that looked more like it belonged in a bank than a home. The rose bushes my grandmother planted, dug up to make room for a sleek fire pit space guests could post about on Instagram. Even my little upstairs room wasn't safe. One summer, I caught the flu bad enough to land me in the hospital for a week. When I came home, suitcase in hand, I found a stranger's luggage sitting where my dresser used to be. Oh, We're trying Airbnb for a bit. Melissa said casually, your room's perfect for it. You can move down to the storage room for now. It's just until we get ahead on bills. That storage room was a damp basement with concrete floors. Even in August, the chill bit through my socks. That night, lying under an old quilt, I could hear them upstairs, the clink of wine glasses, the hum of laughter. They were living in the space I had spent my whole life protecting, while I slept next to a water heater. Friends, I wish I could say I confronted them right then. But if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that the best answers aren't always loud. Sometimes you have to wait for the tide to turn on its own, or learn how to turn it yourself. The turning point came a month later, when I was going through Frank's old desk. Tucked between utility bills and guest ledgers was a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Inside, a life insurance check, $1.2 million. Frank had kept the policy going all those years, just in case. He'd said, well, the just in case had arrived, and along with it, a quiet, steady idea began to take root. I called an old friend, Sam Nolan, a lawyer I'd known since college. He'd been in estate planning for decades, and if anyone knew how to navigate estate planning gone wrong, it was him. We met in a little diner off Route 1. Over clam chowder and cornbread, I told him everything. The Airbnb, the lies, the way they boxed me out of my own life. Sam stirred his chowder thoughtfully. You know, Clara, there are ways to make sure they can't touch the inn. Not now, not ever. You'd have to be careful and patient. But if you want to keep it safe, it can be done. That was the moment my quiet patience shifted into something sharper. We started with property trust, registered in another state with ironclad asset protection laws. On paper, it didn't lead back to me, not directly. Sam handled the filings, the registered agents, all the little details that make a thing invisible if you're not looking in exactly the right place. And then, slowly, we began acquiring. Small, quiet purchases, shares in a local hospitality company, a little stake in a construction firm. All the while, Evan and Melissa strutted around the inn as if it were theirs, talking about expansions and branding. They had no idea that every step they took was on a floor I was quietly laying beneath their feet. Looking back, I think that was when my fear finally gave way to resolve. They saw me as a harmless relic, someone they could shove into a corner. But I was building my corner into a fortress. And my friends, if you think I stopped there, you don't know the half of it. If you've ever mended a fishing net, you know you don't rush it. You tie one knot, check it, tie another, and keep going till the whole thing is strong enough to hold its catch. That's exactly how I went about protecting the Whitmore, in one knot at a time. The first knot was the trust. Sam named it the Coastal Heritage Trust, and on paper it looked like a nonprofit with an interest in preserving historic properties along the Maine coast. In reality, it was the safest lockbox I'd ever had. The trust wasn't in my name. Its mailing address was in another state. The registered agent was a firm that specialized in staying invisible. If someone went looking, they'd just see a list of unrelated shell companies and dead-end P.O. boxes. The second knot came when I learned that the Whitmore property wasn't entirely paid off. Evan had taken out a line of credit against it. That sent my heart into my shoes, but Sam just smiled. That's not necessarily bad news, he said. If the lender ever tries to foreclose and we hold controlling interest in the debt through the trust, you'll be the one in the driver's seat. So we bought the debt, quietly, piece by piece. By the time Evan and Melissa realized how far behind they were on payments, the trust was already holding the note. The third knot was my favorite, the land under the inn. See, Maine has some very particular property laws. If you own the land outright and someone wants to build, expand, or sell, they need your signature, no exceptions. Through a series of small, almost boring transactions over 6 months, the trust became the sole owner of that parcel. Evan still thought he owned the inn, but what he really had was a building on land he didn't control. That was the beauty of it. On paper, the trust was just a silent investor. In reality, it was the spider in the center of the web, and I held the string. Meanwhile, life at the inn rolled along like nothing had changed. Guests came and went. The salt air kept peeling the paint from the shutters, and I kept to my little basement room, as they called it, Melissa liked to joke to her friends that I was living rent-free like a stray cat that won't leave. I'd hear her laughter drifting down the hall, clinking glasses with people she was trying to impress. One evening, I brought up a tray of blueberry scones for the guests in the sunroom. Melissa intercepted me in the hall, her smile tight. "Clara, we have caterers for that now," she said. "You don't need to play innkeeper anymore." I set the tray down on the side table and looked her right in the eye. "Just being neighborly," I said and walked away. Inside, though, I was filing her comment alongside all the others, the little digs, the sideways jabs. Not as bitterness, but as evidence. When you're dealing with family greed and inheritance drama, you don't just remember what they said. You keep a ledger. And then came the day they made their biggest move yet. Over breakfast, Evan announced they'd found a buyer for the inn. A development company from Boston, he said, was offering $18.5 million to turn it into a luxury coastal experience. Melissa's eyes lit up like she'd won the lottery. "We'll finally be able to move into a real house in Bar Harbor. No more drafty halls and leaky roofs." I stirred my tea slowly. "And where will I be?" I asked. Melissa didn't even blink. "You'll have plenty of money for, a nice retirement village." That was when I knew the net was ready. Every knot tied, every string in place. They were about to walk right into it, smiling all the way. Sam and I drew up one more document, a loan agreement from the trust to help them with the deposit for their new deal. It was worded so carefully you'd think it was boring. But buried in the legalese was a clause. If the trust withheld the final funds at any point, the entire deal would collapse and the deposit would be forfeited to the seller. Evan skimmed it. Melissa pretended to read it. They both signed without asking a single question. Why would they? In their minds, the trust was just some anonymous backer, a lucky break from the universe. From that day forward, I watched them parade around like royalty. They told their friends about their pending windfall, about the new chapter they were starting. They picked out furniture for a house they hadn't bought yet. Melissa even started dropping hints to the guests about how they wouldn't be here much longer. I kept my head down, tending my herb garden, making small talk with guests and letting them believe I was irrelevant. All the while, the tide was coming in. And, my friends, when the tide comes in on the Maine coast, it doesn't rush. It creeps, quiet and inevitable, until it swallows everything you thought was safe. The morning of the closing broke cold and clear, the kind of Maine morning where the ocean looks like polished steel. I stood on the porch of the Whitmore Inn, the boards creaking under my slippers, and watched the gulls wheel above the harbor. There was a bite in the air, but I didn't feel it. I'd been waiting for this day for nearly a year, and the chill felt more like a tonic than a threat. Melissa came down the front steps in heels that clicked against the wood, her coat swinging behind her like she was about to step onto a runway. "You ready, Clara?" she asked a little too brightly. "It's a big day." I gave her a small nod. "Oh, yes," I said softly. "It certainly is." The boardroom was a mirror image of that first day I'd been told to sit in the corner. Same polished mahogany table, same expensive coffee scent lingering in the air. The difference was in me. I wasn't just a witness this time. I was the one holding the thread that could unravel everything. Melissa directed me toward a chair at the far end. "Best to keep things simple," she said, her voice smooth but impatient. The realtor shuffled papers, the mortgage broker tapped his pen, and Evan was already leaning over the table with a half-smile he used when he thought he was in control. "Mother," he said, "just a quick signature from you on the power of attorney, and the rest will be handled. You don't need to bother yourself with all the details." I glanced down at the papers in front of me. The heading was in bold, "Permanent Power of Attorney." Beneath it, in fine print, were the words that would give them irrevocable control over the land the trust owned. My land. Melissa's manicured finger tapped the page. "Go ahead, Clara. Just sign so we can all move on." I didn't pick up the pen. Instead, I laid my hands lightly on the folder and looked at her. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of suspicion. The room quieted. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. And that's when the door at the far end opened. Two men walked in, One was a project director for the Boston development firm. The other a sharp-suited attorney I'd met only once before. They didn't glance at Evan or Melissa. They came straight to me. Mrs. Whitmore. The director said with a nod of respect that made Melissa's head snap up, "We have the final documents prepared per your instructions. Without your signature, this transaction cannot proceed." Melissa's mouth actually fell open. "Per her instructions?" she repeated, like the words didn't fit in her mouth. The attorney placed a slim leather folder in front of me. "As co-owner of the development company and sole legal owner of the property parcel, you control the closing. No signature from you, no sale, regardless of contract status." I could feel every gaze in the room shift. Evan's confidence drained in real time. Melissa's cheeks flushed a deep, blotchy red. "You said she was just on the paperwork as a formality." Melissa hissed at Evan, forgetting for a moment that we were not alone. The realtor, the lawyers, the brokers, they all suddenly looked like people who'd realized they were in the wrong meeting. I let the silence hang for a long moment, the way you let a cake cool before slicing it. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a second set of papers. Not the power of attorney they wanted. My papers. "This," I said, sliding them toward the director, "is the transfer of the Whitmore into the Maine Historical Preservation Fund. Effective today." Melissa's voice cracked. "You can't." "Oh, she can," the attorney interrupted, without even glancing her way. I went on, my voice steady. "There's a special clause in there. 2. Every brochure, every plaque, every official mention of this building from now until the end of time will list 2 honorary sponsors, Evan and Melissa Whitmore." Evan blinked, not yet understanding. Melissa understood immediately, and the look on her face was worth every careful knot in the net I tied. Their names would be forever linked to a gift they'd tried to steal, and everyone in town would know it. The project director smiled faintly. "We'll finalize immediately, Mrs. Whitmore." I signed my name, each loop and curve of the letters feeling like I was setting down more than ink. I was setting down years of family betrayal, deed fraud, and property disputes that had eaten at me like salt water on metal. Melissa stood so fast her chair tipped. Evan sat frozen, jaw tight. The rest of the room knew better than to say a word. By the time I stood, the papers were already being gathered, stamped, and sealed. Then wasn't theirs to sell. It never had been. And now it never would be. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. If taking the Whitmore out from under them was the first strike, the second was aimed at something more fragile than any $1 million property. Reputation. See, in a small Maine town, reputation is currency. It's how you get your boat repaired on short notice, how you book a plumber in the middle of winter, how you get fresh lobsters even when the tourists have bought out the docks. And once it's gone, you can't just buy it back, no matter how much money you've got. I'd been quietly preparing this part for months. You remember that storage room basement they sent me to after renting out my bedroom? I'd started keeping a small digital recorder in my knitting basket. Not because I was looking for dirt, but because I'd learned that Melissa's temper ran freer when she thought she was just among friends. And Maine, bless it, is a one-party consent state. As long as I was part of the conversation, I had every legal right to press record. One evening over a bottle of Chardonnay, I heard her through the open kitchen door, laughing to a friend on speakerphone. "The second the papers are signed, I'm shipping that old woman straight to a nursing home. Or better yet, an assisted living with bad soup. She'll thank me for the change of scenery." I didn't react. I just sipped my tea in the corner and let the recorder capture every smug syllable. When the closing day came and went, and they walked out empty-handed, I made my next call, not to Sam this time, but to a local journalist I'd known since she was in high school. She worked for county paper, but also freelance for bigger outlets in Portland. I sent her a recorder with a brief note. "Thought you'd be interested in how some people in our town talk about family." She called me within the hour. "Clara, this is gold. It's cruel, but it's news. You're sure it's legal?" "Perfectly," I said. "Just make sure it runs by noon tomorrow." And it did. By lunchtime the next day, the audio clip was everywhere. On the paper's website, on local Facebook groups, even on a couple of regional radio talk shows. Folks played it over their morning coffee, over lunch at the diner, shaking their heads at the venom in Melissa's voice. Evan and Melissa couldn't walk down Main Street without feeling the burn of eyes on them. The friendly nods disappeared. At the hardware store, customers drifted to other aisles. The women at the cafe where Melissa liked to hold court over lattes stopped coming to her table. It was family greed and elder abuse laid bare for everyone to hear, and it hit them harder than losing the inn. Because here's the thing about living in a tight-knit place. Once your neighbors decide you've got no loyalty, you might as well be invisible, or worse, unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. A week later, the development company pulled out of another project they'd been courting with Evan. Too much negative press, their lawyer said in a curt email. The bank called in one of his lines of credit early. Melissa's boutique lost its two biggest wholesale accounts. They'd built their whole image around being the glamorous couple who rescued the Whitmore Inn. Now they were just the people who tried to steal it from a 72-year-old widow and failed. I didn't gloat. That's not my way. I didn't need to rub salt in the wound. The town did that on its own, in the way it always does, with polite distance, the kind that says we know who you are now, and we're not forgetting it. And still, I stayed quiet, because I knew something they didn't. A fall from grace doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow crumble, and theirs had only just begun. My dear friends, there's a particular hush that falls over a coastal town in late autumn. The tourists go home, the summer flags come down, and the docks creak like old bones settling in. That's how it was the afternoon Evan and Melissa came back to my door. Not as a power couple who once strutted past a Whitmore Inn's front desk, but as two people who looked like they'd been sandblasted by their own storm. The knock was soft, almost shy. I had a pot of chowder on the stove and cornbread cooling on the rack. You can smell butter and sea salt in the kitchen like hours if you stand still long enough. When I opened the door, the wind pushing behind them, and I saw at once what pride won't say out loud. They were out of options. Evan's jaw had the same stubborn set he'd had at 12. We tried to build a raft out of fence boards and nearly drifted into the lobster traps. Melissa was thinner, her polish pulled tight, like a dress one size too small. Rain beaded on her coat. She didn't meet my eyes. Mom, Evan started, and the words sounded both too late and too early. We're in a bind. I stepped back as any Mainer would, coming out of that wind. They took their old places at the table like muscle memory. I ladled chowder. I didn't ask if they were hungry. I've never met a soul who isn't one way or another. The steam rose between us, and for a moment I could almost pretend we were a different family on a different day. Then Melissa spoke. We just need a place for a while, she said, fingers tracing the rim of her bowl, until we get back on our feet. There it was, the script they rehearsed in the car, all the words avoiding the words they didn't want to say. Family betrayal, property disputes, the inheritance drama they'd authored and then lost control of. I let the silence sit. In a kitchen like mine, silence has the dignity of old wood and kettle steam. It tells the truth without raising its voice. How long is a while? I asked. Evan cleared his throat. A couple of months. Maybe 3. The Bar Harbor place fell through. A lender backed out after the articles. He didn't say real estate fraud. He didn't say deed fraud, family manipulation, or the clip that played on every phone from here to Portland. But you could hear those words rustling in the corners with the drafts. I poured them tea. Melissa's hand shook just enough to clink the spoon against porcelain. People can be cruel, she said. You make one mistake and 2 dozen, I said gently, that I know of. She looked up then. Not angry, not yet. Just surprised I would meet her where she stood and refused to move an inch. There was a time I'd have filled the awkward space with nervous kindness, stacked it with extra biscuits and excuses. That time was gone. You learn a woman's worth doesn't grow in a room that expects her to shrink. I'm not asking for much, she said. You already took that. I answered, not unkindly. Outside, a gull cried like a hinge. Somewhere on the street a truck downshifted, the sound of a working town minding its business. I thought of all the ways the scene could go, the family lawsuit some viewers would cheer for, the dramatic eviction, the slap of a door. But remember our kitchen philosophy. We don't confuse spectacle with justice. We choose the path that leaves our hands clean enough to break bread. You can finish your tea, I said, and then I've made some calls. Evan's head snapped up. Calls. There's a respectable extended stay lodge 2 towns over. Quiet place. Owners are kind. They'll set you up for 8 weeks at a reduced rate. Enough time to find work and a rental. I also spoke with Pastor Liza. The church pantry can help with groceries while you're sorting things. Melissa bristled like I'd handed her a mop. We're not charity cases. Not charity, I said. Consequences. Different word. Different weather. For a second, the old Melissa rose, the one who had laughed in the sunroom and called me a long-time housekeeper, to strangers. I watched the impulse run across her face, then flicker out. There's something about a quiet kitchen that makes bluster feel foolish. Even she could hear it. Evan tried another door. What about the guest room over the porch? He asked, voice small. Just for a week. The porch room belongs to travelers, I said softly. People who come here tired and leave seen. You had that room once. You chose a different path. He looked down at his hands, the very hands I'd taught to knot a tie and fix a leaky faucet. You can love a child with your entire life and still refuse him a thing that would make both of you smaller. You're turning us away, he said, not a question but a bruise. I'm turning you toward your next right thing. I slid 2 envelopes across the table. The lodge details, a list of day labor crews hiring through winter. You start at 7 a.m. tomorrow down at Jensen's boatyard. It's hard work. Good work. It will put weight back on your words. Melissa's eyes flashed. Manual labor? She said it like it was a foreign language. I smiled, a touch of humor. Not to mock, just to soften the stone. You get used to it. I did. After all, we're only talking 50-pound crates, not million-dollar property deeds. The corner of Evan's mouth twitched. A crack in the ice. We ate. Real eating. The kind where you don't gossip or pose or sell. Chowder demands both hands and both eyes. It forgives no vanity. When we finished, I wrapped 2 pieces of cornbread in wax paper and set them by the door. Melissa stared at them like a test she wasn't sure how'd pass. I'll take those, Evan said, and she didn't argue. As they stood, I walked them to the entryway where the old captain's clock ticks like a heart, then smelled of lemon oil and books. I'd rubbed the banister that morning, anointing what remains. They paused beneath the whalebone arch frank, and I put up the year we installed a community library on the 2nd floor. Hundreds of hands have passed there, the oils of strangers and neighbors binding into a kind of blessing. Clara, Evan said, and his voice was a weathered thing. Are we ever going to be okay? There's a difference between being forgiven, I said, and being allowed back into the place you broke. Forgiveness is mine to give. Access is mine to guard. I touched his sleeve, a mother's permission to be startled by his own life and still take responsibility for it. Go build something that doesn't require someone else to disappear. Melissa finally met my eyes. I saw fear there, but also a small, skittish animal called honesty. I thought, she said, and stopped, swallowing. I thought if we had the inn, if people saw us as owners, it would make everything line up, like in those glossy magazines. Power couple restores historic gem. Her laugh wasn't cruel now. It was a laugh of someone who has paid retail for an illusion. Turns out the headline was Toxic In-Laws Attempt Inheritance Theft and Commit Deed Fraud. Headlines change, I said. Obituaries, too. They went down the steps with their shoulders squared against the drizzle. Neighbors across the street pretended to inspect mailboxes, that old New England habit of watching without staring. Evan opened the car door for Melissa. She got in carefully, dignity not quite dead. He circled to the driver's side and paused, looking back at the house like a man at the edge of water, remembering how to swim. When they pulled away, I stood on the porch and breathed the air that makes statements unnecessary. I wasn't jubilant. This wasn't a victory parade. It was the sound of a ledger closing softly, entries balanced a penny. In another life, on another coast, maybe it would be Oregon real estate and a different set of tides. Betrayal has a way of learning the coastline. But justice, the kind that fits in a kitchen, is always local. Inside, I rinsed bowls and wiped the table. I set the kettle back on for whoever might knock next. A traveler with a story to trade, a neighbor with a busted latch, a granddaughter who needed to know that estate planning gone wrong doesn't mean the story is over, only that the author woke up and reclaimed the pen. Before dusk, I walked out to the garden, the damp soil giving under my boots, rosemary waking up when I brushed it with my hand. The sign on the gate, Whitmore Inn, entry by invitation only, caught a sliver of late sun. The letters looked gold for a heartbeat, then turned back to plain paint, which is what gold should be when you're done dreaming. I thought about calling Sam to tell him how it went, about sending a quick note to the journalist who'd handled the recording with a decency I don't take for granted. Instead, I knelt by the last row of kale and pulled a weed shaped like regret. It came up easy. Some things do once you stop pretending they belong. As the first porch lamp clicked on, I heard the harbor bells begin their patient counting. Out beyond the point, a trawler moved like a truth through dark water, unshowy, necessary, on time. I wiped my hands on my apron and went inside to set more places at the table. We feed who we can. We protect what's ours. We let the rest be taught by weather. And if you're wondering whether this is where the story ends, you know better. This is Maine. We still have winter coming, and with the last piece of business, not with a slammed door or shouted name, but with a final act that says what no courtroom can, restitution measured in dignity, for a house, a town, and an old woman's peace. There's a different kind of quiet after a storm. It's not the same as a hush before trouble. It's warmer, heavier, like the walls themselves are taking a breath. That's what the Whitmore Inn felt like in the weeks after Evan and Melissa drove away. The tension that had clung to the hallways was gone. The old would stop creaking under the weight of secrets. Even the smell in the kitchen shifted, cinnamon and coffee again, instead of expensive perfume that didn't belong to this place. I wasn't about to let the inn drift without a captain. You can't just remove the problem and expect the ship to sail straight. There had been family betrayal, yes, but then it had also been left adrift, half loved and half abandoned. If I'd learned anything from years of watching this coast, it was that a harbor untended invites rot. The first thing I did was call Margaret Pierce from the Maine Historical Preservation Fund. She came by with her wool scarf tucked up around her chin, carrying a leather satchel full of paperwork and possibility. We walked every inch of the place, the guest rooms, the attic with its cedar chests, the gardens where my grandmother's lilacs were still holding on. Margaret didn't just see the inn's charm. She saw its scars. You can't heal the history without honoring it, she said, running her fingers over the original banister. We'll restore it, but we'll keep the fingerprints. We set a plan in motion that would make the inn self-sustaining and protected. The kind of estate planning I wished I'd done decades ago. The trust that had shielded the property from deed fraud and inheritance theft would now fund repairs, pay staff, and guarantee the inn could never be sold without the Preservation Fund's board approval. Not by me, not by anyone. Word got out in town quickly. In a place like ours, you can't change the curtains without it being a cafe chatter by afternoon. Folks started stopping by with offers. A retired carpenter to help refinish the floors. A couple of local high school kids to weed the gardens for the summer. Some came because they missed the inn's glory days. Others came because they'd heard about what happened and wanted to stand in the corner of the story where the light was. One of the sweetest moments came on a Wednesday morning when Mrs. Callahan from up the hill knocked on the kitchen door. She's in her 80s now, but still walks with the brisk pace of a woman who once ran the post office. She set down a cardboard box wrapped in butcher's paper. "My mother embroidered these," she said. Inside were 12 linen napkins, edges trimmed in tiny blue anchors. They belong here. Restoration wasn't just about wood and paint. It was about returning the soul of the place, stitch by stitch. We reopened the library on the second floor, the same one Melissa had wanted to turn into a wellness spa, because books don't photograph well for brochures. The shelves smelled of cedar and paper again. I set out a guest book, and the first entry was from a fisherman named Jack who used to stay here every winter. "Feels like home again," he wrote. And the thing was, it did. Of course, the outside world still had its questions. A few real estate bloggers reached out, sniffing around for the juicier side of the real estate fraud and family lawsuit rumors. I gave them the same answer I'd give anyone leaning over a fence of pry. The truth is in the registry office. The rest is just gossip. What I didn't tell them was that the real victory wasn't just that I protected $1 million property from toxic in-laws. It was that I'd redirected it towards something the town actually needed, a place that welcomed strangers as guests, not targets for a markup. By December, the restoration was far enough along that we could host our first event, a fundraiser for the local Fishermen's Relief Fund. We strung white lights across the porch, lit the fireplaces, and served chowder in mismatched bowls that had been here longer than me. The hall was full of neighbors laughing, eating, telling stories over the clink of spoons against ceramic. More than once that night, I caught someone glancing at me with a kind of quiet gratitude that doesn't need words. This wasn't about making me a hero. It was about seeing it alive again, not stripped for parts, not locked in legal knots, but whole. And here's the part one want you to really hear, my friends. Restoring what was stolen doesn't mean you invite the thieves back to admire the work. Evan and Melissa never set foot inside after that closing day. The Preservation Fund made sure of it. If they wanted to see it, they could look at the brochures just like anyone else. Their names were still there as honorary sponsors, printed on a donation plaque in the foyer, but now, instead of pride, it was a reminder to the whole town, to them. On quiet mornings, when the sun slid to the lace curtains and painted the dining room in gold, I'd sit with my coffee and think about how close we'd come to losing it all, to letting family manipulation and greed swallow something meant for more than one family's pockets. It's a strange thing, the balance between forgiveness and boundaries. You can let go of the anger without handing someone the keys they tried to steal. That's what restoration meant here. Returning the keys to the right locks, the rooms to the right purposes, and the story to the right hands. The inn was safe. My peace was intact. But there was still one final act before I could truly close the book on the Whitmore betrayal. It wouldn't involve a courtroom or another headline, just a winter's day, a quiet choice, and the kind of closure you don't need to announce to anyone but yourself. Winter along the Maine coast isn't something you measure in inches of snow. You measure it in how long the wind can moan to the clapboards before you start talking back to it. The harbor freezes in jagged plates. The gulls vanish inland, and even the most stubborn fishermen hang their oilskins in the shed. It was during one of those brittle January mornings that I decided it was time to settle the last entry in my personal ledger, the one labeled not with numbers, but with the weight of unfinished business. The inn was safe. The Preservation Fund had full stewardship, and the community had wrapped around it like an old quilt. But I still carried the final thread of the story, and it needed tying off. You see, protecting the inn had been about property disputes, inheritance drama, and shutting down a long run of family manipulation. But there's another kind of theft that happens when someone spends years convincing you you're smaller than you are. It's not on any deed. It's not a line item in a family lawsuit. It's personal property, your dignity, and it takes its own kind of reclamation. The opportunity came in the form of an envelope from a local attorney's office. Inside was a notice that Evan and Melissa had filed for bankruptcy. They were liquidating what was left, a car, some jewelry, and, ironically, a small plot of coastal land they bought years ago as an investment. It wasn't worth much by market standards, but it sat along a rocky inlet I'd loved since I was a girl. Frank and I used to take Sunday walks there, picking beach roses in the summer. It was one of those places a tourist never found because it didn't photograph well, too raw, too honest. I called Sam. Buy it, I said. We did, through the same trust that had saved the inn from deed fraud. It was a quiet sale, no fanfare. When the paperwork was final, I walked that stretch of shore alone. The tide was out, revealing black mussel beds and slick green rock. The air smelled like every memory I'd ever loved. Standing there, I realized this was more than just a land purchase. It was me reclaiming something they thought they could keep. Not the property itself, but the audacity to decide what belonged to me. It was a bookend. The last page of a chapter that had started with them telling me I had no place at my own table. I didn't tell anyone in town. Some victories don't need witnesses. Instead, I started making plans for the inlet. No condos, no boutique cabins. I cleared a narrow footpath, put in a weathered bench at the best lookout, and planted 2 rose bushes where the view caught the afternoon sun. There's no sign to mark it, no plaque with my name. The people who walk there just know it as a quiet place. That's all I wanted it to be. Back at the inn, the The winter passed in a rhythm of small tasks. Mending quilts, brewing chowder for the few guests brave enough to travel in snow, polishing the banisters so they'd glow when spring light came back. Sometimes I'd think of Evan and Melissa, not with the hot sting of anger, but the cool detachment of someone looking at old headlines. They'd wanted $1 million property as a trophy. I'd turned it into a refuge. One afternoon in late February, a letter arrived from Evan, just one page. He wrote that they were moving out of state, starting over. No apology, but no bitterness either. It read like a man who'd learned a lesson the hard way and didn't have the breath to dress it up. I put it in the kitchen drawer where I keep recipes and other odd scraps worth keeping, not because I planned to revisit it, but because it belonged to the story, and the story was now part of the inn's history. That night, I lit a fire in the library and sat with a cup of tea, listening to the old walls settle. I thought about all the legal documents, the trust agreements, the recordings, the quiet conversations over coffee with people who believed me when it mattered. This hadn't just been about saving a building. It had been about showing that elder abuse and inheritance theft can be met with strategy instead of surrender. And maybe that's why I felt lighter than I had in years. Because in the end, my greatest victory wasn't that Evan and Melissa lost. It was that I'd won back my life without becoming the thing they'd accused me of: bitter, small, powerless. The winter ledger was balanced. The last page turned. And outside, beyond the inn's windows, the snow along the garden gate caught the moonlight in a way that made it look almost like gold leaf. A reminder that value isn't always in the market price. Spring would come. Guests would return. And when they asked about the inn's history, I'd pour them coffee and tell them the true parts. The parts worth passing on, leaving the rest to drift out with the tide. Spring arrived like it always does in Maine, slowly, cautiously, as if it doesn't quite trust itself to stay. The harbor thawed in sheets. The lilac buds swelled, and the morning fog smelled faintly of salt and damp earth instead of snow. The Whitmore Inn, my stubborn old ship, was still standing proud, its shingles glistening in the dew. The first weekend of May brought our opening luncheon. A simple affair, just chowder, biscuits, and lemon pie. But the dining room was full again. Neighbors, travelers, a few out-of-towners who'd read about the inn in the Preservation Fund's newsletter. The hum of conversation under the high ceiling made the place sound alive in a way I hadn't heard in years. I moved from table to table, topping off coffee, answering questions about the renovations. When I stepped back into the kitchen for more pie, I caught my reflection in the little square mirror above the spice rack. My hair had more silver than the last time I'd looked closely, but my eyes, they were bright. I realized I wasn't carrying the weight of family betrayal, property disputes, or inheritance drama anymore. After dessert, Margaret Pierce from the Preservation Fund tapped her glass. "Friends," she said, "this is more than a building. It's a reminder that history can be saved, and sometimes from the very people who should have been protecting it." She didn't name Evan or Melissa, and she didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew the story, in their own way. I stood beside her and added, "We can't choose a family we're born into, but we can choose a family we build around a table." That got a few nods, the kind that come from people who've lived their own versions of family greed, estate planning gone wrong, and property theft. After the guests left, I took my tea out to porch. The roses I planted at the inlet property, the one Evan and Melissa had been forced to sell, were starting to bloom. I'd visited them the week before, pruning away the winter's damage. Standing there, the ocean spread out before me, I understood that my quiet reclamation wasn't just about land or buildings. It was about teaching myself, and maybe others, that you can meet toxic in-laws, real estate fraud, and inheritance theft without letting them hollow you out. The inn was safe now, with bylaws that made deed fraud impossible. The Preservation Fund held the oversight, the trust still controlled the land, and the community had a stake in keeping it alive. No one could take it from us. Not a smooth-talking developer, not a charming but conniving relative, not even a market downturn. But beyond the legal safety nets, there was something else I'd secured, my own voice. For years, I'd let Melissa's cutting remarks and Evan's dismissals push me into corners. They thought my silence meant defeat. They didn't understand that silence in the right hands is a blade that only strikes once, at exactly the right moment. I thought about the recording I'd released months ago, the one that had peeled back the polite mask Melissa wore in public. I hadn't heard from them since Evan's short letter in February. Maybe they were gone for good, maybe not. But it no longer mattered. The line had been drawn, the gate locked, and the sign hung. Entry by invitation only. That sign had become more than a garden decoration. It was a principle. You don't let just anyone walk into your life and rearrange the furniture, literal or otherwise. You set the table for those who understand what it means to be there. As the sun dipped lower, painting the harbor gold, I closed my eyes and let the sound of the tide settle me. In that moment, I knew I'd written the ending to this family lawsuit without a gavel, reshaped an Oregon real estate level battle without leaving my main porch, and reclaimed $1 million property without losing the kitchen table warmth that made it worth saving. This was my last word on the matter, not shouted in a courtroom or typed in a headline, but spoken into the salt air. Silence is not surrender. It is preparation. And should anyone ever try to test the locks on my life again, they'll find the same thing Evan and Melissa did, that the woman they thought they could push aside had been holding the deed, the keys, and the final say all along. My dear friends, if you followed me this far, you know this isn't just a story of a house or a stack of legal papers. It's the story of how you can lose your place at the table, the one you built, polished, and set for years, and still find your way back to the head of it without raising your voice. The Whitmore Inn still stands here on the Maine coast. When the gulls swoop low over the porch and the smell of chowder drift from the kitchen, it feels like it always should have. Open to the right people. Closed to those who mistake kindness for weakness. We've had our share of guests this spring. A pair of teachers from Vermont, a young couple celebrating their anniversary. Even a writer who claimed he came to finish a book but mostly sat in the library staring out at the harbor. They all left a little note in the guest book, and each one feels like a new chapter written on top of the old hurt. Sometimes visitors ask about the framed photo near the front desk, the one of the inn in 1931, with my grandparents standing proud in front. I tell them how the place passed down through hands that worked for it, loved it, cared for it, until it reached mine. I don't tell them every detail of the family betrayal, property disputes, or inheritance drama, not because I'm hiding it, but because I'd rather they see the inn as it is now, safe, steady, and honest. The truth is, you don't have to relive the fight to appreciate the win. Now and then, a neighbor will mention Evan and Melissa. They've moved out of state, started some small business far from here. I wish them no harm. In fact, I wish them exactly what they earned, a chance to rebuild without stepping on someone else's foundation. I hope they've learned that family greed and estate planning gone wrong aren't just phrases in a lawyer's file. They're wounds that take years to heal. I've learned my own lessons, too. One is that real estate fraud and deed fraud don't always look like strangers with forged signatures. Sometimes they look like someone you fed at your own table. Another is that elder abuse doesn't always mean bruises. It can be the slow stripping away of your voice until you choose to take it back. But the biggest lesson? That silence, when used with care, can be sharper than any shout. It lets the other side believe they've won right up until the moment you place your move on the table, and the game is over. The inn is protected now by a trust that not even the cleverest lawyer could untangle without the preservation fund's blessing. The $1 million property they thought they could snatch is now a community treasure. Their names remain on the donation plaque, not out of spite, but as a permanent reminder that history records all the players, not just the victors. On quiet afternoons, I sit in the garden with a cup of tea, watching the roses at the gate sway in the breeze. The sign still hangs there, entry by invitation only. Guests think it's charming. I know it's a promise. So if you're listening to this at your own kitchen table, maybe with a pie cooling on the sill or a pot roast in the oven, take this from me. Guard what's yours, not just with locks and papers, but with the unshakable certainty that you deserve to keep it. Don't mistake patience for passivity. Don't let anyone convince you that your place at the table is theirs to give. And if the day comes when someone tries to push you into the corner, remember, you can sit there for a while. You can let them believe the corner is where you'll stay. Because when the time is right, you'll stand up, take the head seat again, and serve the final course yourself. That, my dear friends, is how you win a fight without spilling your tea. Now, let's pour another cup. We've earned it. Life has a way of testing our patience, especially when the people we trust the most become the source of our deepest wounds. This story is a reminder that betrayal, whether through family greed, inheritance theft, or manipulation, doesn't have to be met with rage or revenge. Instead, it can be answered with strategy, patience, and the quiet confidence that justice will come when the time is right. Protect what's yours, not just your property, but your dignity and peace of mind. Set boundaries that are firm yet fair, and remember that silence can be a powerful tool when it's used with purpose. You don't need to fight every battle loudly. Sometimes the most decisive victories are the ones planned in stillness and revealed at the perfect moment. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment with number 1 to let me know you have watched the whole video. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to always receive new videos as soon as possible.